The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning. People filled every seat, and some even stood along the back wall. Everyone had come to see the case of the 17-year-old boy accused of spray painting horrible words all over Lincoln High School. The damage was serious. Thousands of dollars worth of paint covered the main building, and the whole community was angry about it. Judge Richard Dawson sat behind his tall wooden desk, looking down at the papers in front of him. He was known around town as a tough judge who didn't take any nonsense from anyone. Some people respected him for it. Others thought he was too harsh, especially with young people. But nobody could deny that his courtroom always ran on time and by the book. The boy stood in the middle of the room wearing clothes that looked a bit too big for him. His name was Daniel, and he looked smaller than most 17-year-olds. His shoulders were hunched forward, and he kept his eyes locked on the floor. His hands shook slightly at his sides, though he tried to keep them still. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said in his deep voice, "you've been charged with criminal mischief and vandalism of school property. How do you plead?" Silence. Daniel didn't move. He didn't look up. He just stood there staring at the floor like he was frozen in place. The judge waited a few seconds, then leaned forward. "Young man, I asked you a question. You need to answer the court. How do you plead to these charges?" More silence. The only sound in the courtroom was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and someone coughing in the back row. Daniel's chest moved up and down with his breathing, but that was the only sign that he was even aware of what was happening around him. In the front row, a woman in her 40s clutched a tissue in her hand. This was Daniel's mother, Lisa. She worked 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She had been crying for days, ever since the police showed up at their door with the accusations against her son. She wanted to stand up and speak for him, but she knew that wasn't how court worked. Daniel had to answer for himself. Judge Dawson's patience was starting to wear thin. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened and how he tapped his pen against his desk. "Mr. Thompson, this is your last chance to cooperate with this court. If you refuse to answer, I'll have to enter a plea on your behalf, and that won't help your case." Still nothing. Daniel's hands were shaking more now, but he didn't speak. He didn't even try to open his mouth. Behind Daniel sat his lawyer, a young woman named Katie Chen. She had only been practicing law for about a year, and most of her cases were simple traffic violations or minor disputes. This was the biggest case she'd ever handled, and she looked nervous. She kept glancing at Daniel, then at the judge, then down at her papers. Something was clearly bothering her, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if it was the right time. The people watching from the gallery started to whisper among themselves. Some were teachers from Daniel's school. Others were parents of students who went there. A few were just local residents who had read about the case in the newspaper and wanted to see what would happen. "Unbelievable," someone muttered loud enough for others to hear. "No respect at all." Judge Dawson heard it too. He looked at Daniel with a mixture of frustration and something that almost looked like amusement. "What's the matter, son? Cat got your tongue?" A few people in the courtroom laughed. It wasn't loud laughter, more like uncomfortable chuckling, but it was there. The judge had a slight smirk on his face now, like he found the whole situation a bit ridiculous. "Your Honor?" Katie suddenly stood up, her voice a bit shaky. "May I approach the bench, please?" The judge waved his hand dismissively. "Counselor, your client needs to answer the court. That's what needs to happen right now." "I understand that, Your Honor, but there's something you need to know. It's important, please." Katie's voice was more insistent now, almost desperate. Judge Dawson sighed and looked at the clock on the wall. "Fine. Approach." Katie gathered some papers from her folder and walked quickly to the judge's desk. The court reporter and the prosecutor followed behind her. They all stood there, speaking in hushed voices that the rest of the courtroom couldn't hear. As Katie spoke, handing the judge some documents, his expression started to change. The smirk disappeared first. Then his eyebrows went up. He looked at the papers, then at Katie, then back at the papers again. His face, which had been slightly red with frustration, went pale. "Why wasn't I informed of this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I filed it with the clerk's office 3 days ago, Your Honor," Katie explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to speak with you before the hearing started, but yes. I was running late from the Henderson case." The judge cut her off, staring at the documents in his hands like they were something he couldn't quite believe. He looked over at Daniel, who was still standing in the same position, still staring at the floor. "This is confirmed? By medical professionals?" "Yes, Your Honor, multiple doctors. The reports are all there." The prosecutor, a man in his 50s named James Peterson, leaned in to look at the papers. His confident expression started to fade too. He had been so sure this was an open and shut case. 2 witnesses had identified Daniel. The evidence seemed clear. But now, looking at these documents, he realized something had gone very wrong. Judge Dawson set the papers down and rubbed his face with both hands. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone sensed that something had shifted, though they didn't know what. Lisa clutched her tissue tighter, holding her breath. "We need a recess," the judge finally said, his voice much quieter than before. 15 minutes. Everyone out. The bailiff stood up. "All rise." People slowly filed out of the courtroom, confused and whispering. What had the lawyer shown the judge? Why did he look so shocked? What was happening? Daniel's mother walked over to him and gently touched his shoulder. He looked at her for the first time since entering the courtroom, and she could see the fear in his eyes. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "It's going to be okay." But she didn't know if that was true. She had no idea what those papers said or why the judge had reacted that way. All she knew was that her son was in trouble, and there was nothing she could do to protect him from what was coming. Judge Dawson sat alone at his bench after everyone left, staring at the medical reports in front of him. His mind replayed his words from just minutes ago. "Cat got your tongue?" The laughter from the courtroom echoed in his memory. He felt something he rarely felt in his courtroom: shame. Judge Dawson called for another short recess. He needed time to think about what he'd just seen and heard. The people in the courtroom filed out again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Everyone was talking about the security footage and what it meant. Some people looked angry. Others looked confused. A few looked pleased that the truth was finally coming out. Lisa hugged Daniel tightly in the hallway outside the courtroom. He leaned into her, still unable to speak but clearly exhausted from the stress. Katie stood nearby, giving them privacy but keeping a watchful eye on her client. She knew this wasn't over yet. When court resumed, Judge Dawson looked more composed, but you could still see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," he announced. "Bailiff, I want Tyler Brooks brought into this courtroom immediately, and Jessica Martinez as well." Jessica was the other witness who had claimed to see Daniel that night. She had been sitting in the back of the courtroom the whole time, and now her face went white as a sheet. The bailiff walked over to her and asked her to come forward. She stood up on shaky legs and made her way to the witness stand. "Miss Martinez," the judge said, not unkindly but very seriously, "you're under oath. I want you to think very carefully about your answers. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely audible. Katie stood up to question her. "Jessica, you testified that you saw Daniel Thompson near the school on the night of the vandalism. Is that correct?" "Yes." "How far away were you from the person you saw?" Jessica shifted in her seat. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 50 feet?" 50 feet. "And what time was this?" "Around 10 o'clock. Was it dark outside?" "Yes, but there are streetlights." Katie nodded. "What was the person wearing?" "A dark hoodie. Jeans, I think." "Did you see the person's face?" Jessica hesitated. "Not clearly, but—" "Not clearly," Katie repeated. "So you identified Daniel Thompson from 50 feet away in the dark, without seeing his face clearly?" Tyler said it was him." The courtroom stirred. That was not the answer Jessica should have given. Katie pounced on it. "Tyler said it was him? So you didn't actually identify Daniel yourself? You just agreed with what Tyler told you?" Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I mean, it looked like him too. Tyler saw him first and pointed him out." "Jessica, do you have any history with Daniel Thompson? Any past interactions or conflicts?" The girl's face flushed red. Not really. "That's interesting. Because I have statements from several students that you and Tyler both bullied Daniel's friends back in middle school. There was an incident where Tyler threw one of Daniel's friends' backpack into the pond behind the school. Do you remember that?" "That was years ago," Jessica protested weakly. "It was 3 years ago. And Daniel stood up to Tyler that day, didn't he? Called him out in front of everyone. Tyler doesn't like Daniel very much because of that, does he? I don't know. I guess." Katie walked back to her table and picked up another document. Did the prosecutor tell you that lying under oath is perjury? That it's a crime? Jessica started crying. I didn't think... Tyler was so sure. He said Daniel was always weird and creepy and probably did it. I just believed him. Judge Dawson leaned forward. Miss Martinez, did you actually see Daniel Thompson that night? Yes or no? Through her tears, Jessica shook her head. No, I saw someone in a hoodie, but I didn't see who it was. Tyler told me it was Daniel, and I just believed him. The courtroom erupted again. Judge Dawson banged his gavel. One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom, he warned. Just then, the bailiff returned with Tyler Brooks. The 18-year-old looked confident at first, walking in with his chest puffed out like he owned the place. But when he saw Jessica crying on the witness stand and the judge's angry face, some of that confidence faded. Mr. Brooks, Judge Dawson said, his voice dangerously calm, take the stand. Tyler sat down and adjusted the microphone. He still looked like he thought he could talk his way out of whatever was happening. He was the star quarterback after all. He was used to getting out of trouble. Mr. Brooks, Katie began, standing up and facing him directly. You testified that you saw Daniel Thompson vandalizing the school. Is that correct? Yeah, that's right. What time did you see him? Around 10 p.m. And where were you? Walking home from a friend's house. Which friend? Tyler paused for just a second. Kevin Davis. And you saw Daniel from how far away? I don't know, like 50 feet or something. Katie pulled out a diagram of the school and the surrounding streets. Can you show the court exactly where you were standing and where you saw this person? Tyler came down and pointed to a spot on the map. I was here and he was over there by the main building. That's actually closer to 70 feet according to this scale. And it was dark? Yeah, but like I told the cops, I'd know that kid anywhere. He's always lurking around. Always lurking around, Katie repeated. That's interesting language. Would you say you like Daniel? Tyler shrugged. He's weird. Never talks to anyone. It's creepy. Because he has a medical condition that prevents him from speaking in public. Did you know that? I don't know anything about that. All I know is what I saw. Katie walked back to her table and picked up several photographs. Mr. Brooks, do you know why Daniel doesn't talk in public? I told you I don't know. He has severe anxiety and trauma from watching his father die. But you wouldn't know about that, because you've never bothered to get to know him, have you? You've just decided he's weird and creepy. Objection, Peterson said weakly. Relevance? Goes to bias, Your Honor, Katie responded. Overruled. Continue. Katie held up the photographs. Mr. Brooks, these are pictures of 3 different students from your school. All of them are about Daniel's height and build. All of them regularly wear dark hoodies. Can you tell me which one is Daniel? Tyler looked at the photos. They were taken from about 50 feet away, in similar lighting to that night. He pointed to one. That one, Katie smiled. That's Brian Henderson. Want to try again? Tyler's confidence was cracking. He pointed to another one. That one, Michael Torres. Strike 2. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was watching Tyler squirm. This is stupid, Tyler said. Of course I can't tell from these pictures. But that night I saw him up close. Up close? You just said 50 feet. That's not up close. That's more than half a football field away. I meant I could see him clearly enough. Katie pulled out her laptop again. Let's watch that security footage one more time, shall we? The video played on the screen. The 2 figures spray painting the building were clearly visible. One of them turned slightly toward the camera, and even with the grainy quality you could make out his profile. Mr. Brooks, that's you, isn't it? No, really? Because our forensic expert analyzed the height, build, and gait of both individuals in this video. The one on the left matches your measurements exactly. The one on the right matches your friend Kevin Davis. Tyler's face was red now. That's not me. Then why did earlier footage show you and Kevin entering the school grounds at 9:30 p.m.? We didn't. Katie played another clip. 2 figures, one clearly wearing a Letterman jacket, walking onto school property. The timestamp read 9:32 p.m. That's your jacket, isn't it? Number 12. Your football number. Tyler didn't answer. And the cameras mysteriously went offline right after you entered the building. The cameras you have access to as a teacher's assistant in the computer lab. I don't know anything about that. Judge Dawson had heard enough. Mr. Brooks, I'm going to ask you one direct question, and I strongly suggest you tell the truth. Did you vandalize that school? Tyler looked around the courtroom. He saw all the faces staring at him. He saw the video evidence. He saw his friend Kevin in the back row looking terrified. And he realized he was caught. "I want a lawyer," he said quietly. The courtroom exploded in noise again. Judge Dawson let it go on for a few seconds before banging his gavel. "Mr. Brooks, you're being detained for questioning regarding perjury and vandalism. Bailiff, take him into custody." As Tyler was led away, he shot a look at Daniel that was pure hatred. But Daniel wasn't looking at him. He was staring at the floor just like he'd been doing all day. Judge Dawson turned to Peterson. "Mr. Prosecutor, I'm dismissing all charges against Daniel Thompson immediately. Furthermore, I'm recommending an investigation into how this case was handled. 2 false witnesses, evidence that was never examined, and a young man with a disability who was put through this nightmare because of sloppy police work and prosecutorial negligence." Peterson looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Yes, Your Honor. And I'll be filing a complaint with the State Bar Association about your conduct in this matter. You may not have known the witnesses were lying, but you had a responsibility to do a thorough investigation before bringing charges. You failed in that responsibility. Your Honor, You're dismissed, Counselor." Peterson gathered his papers and left the courtroom, his head down. Some people in the gallery actually clapped, which made the judge bang his gavel again. "This is still a courtroom, not a theater," he reminded them sternly. Then he looked at Daniel, who was still standing in the same spot, still staring down. The boy's whole body was trembling and tears were running down his face even though he made no sound. What happened next shocked everyone in the courtroom. Judge Dawson stood up from his bench. In all his years on the bench, he had never done what he was about to do. Judges stayed up on their platform. They maintained distance. They were figures of authority, separate from the people who came before them. But right now, looking at Daniel standing there shaking and crying silently, Judge Dawson couldn't stay separated anymore. He stepped down from the bench and walked across the courtroom. Every eye followed him. People stopped whispering. The room went completely quiet. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, unsure if she should be recording this. The judge stopped right in front of Daniel. The boy didn't look up. He just stood there, tears dripping onto the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Daniel," Judge Dawson said softly, "Son, can you look at me?" It took a moment, but slowly Daniel raised his head. His eyes were red and full of pain that no 17-year-old should have to carry. When he looked at the judge, he flinched slightly, like he expected to be yelled at or punished. "I owe you an apology," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just as a judge, but as a human being. I made fun of you. I laughed at you. I did that without knowing anything about what you've been through or why you couldn't speak. And that was wrong. That was deeply, deeply wrong." Some people in the courtroom started crying. This was not what anyone had expected to see today. "You came into my courtroom scared and dealing with something that most of us can't even imagine," the judge continued. "And instead of showing you patience and understanding, I showed you impatience and cruelty. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm truly sorry." Daniel's shoulders shook harder. New tears ran down his face. His mother was sobbing in the front row, her hand over her mouth. Judge Dawson reached out and gently placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You didn't deserve any of this. Not the false accusations, not the way those boys treated you, and certainly not the way I treated you. You deserved better." Then the judge did something that made several people in the courtroom gasp. He pulled Daniel into a hug. Not a formal, awkward pat on the back, but a real embrace, the kind a father gives a son. Daniel stood stiff for a moment, unsure what to do, then slowly wrapped his arms around the judge and let himself cry. They stood like that for almost a minute while the courtroom watched in silence. When they finally pulled apart, Judge Dawson had tears in his own eyes. He walked over to Lisa and hugged her too. "You've raised a strong young man," he told her. "What he's been through, what he's dealing with, and he's still standing. That takes incredible strength." Lisa couldn't speak. She just nodded and hugged him back, crying into his shoulder. When the judge returned to his bench, he had to take a moment to compose himself. He wiped his eyes and cleared his throat. "This case," he began, "has shown me something I should have learned a long time ago. We judge people by what we see on the surface. We make assumptions about who they are and why they act the way they do. And sometimes those assumptions are not just wrong, they're harmful." He looked around the courtroom at all the people watching. "Daniel Thompson is not weird or creepy. He's not disrespectful or defiant. He's a young man dealing with trauma and a medical condition that most of us can't understand. But instead of trying to understand, people made assumptions. They bullied him. They accused him of crimes he didn't commit, and they almost destroyed his life because of it. The judge picked up the medical reports that Katie had given him. Selective mutism is a real condition. It's documented. It's recognized by medical professionals, and it's not something anyone would choose to have. Imagine wanting desperately to speak, to defend yourself, to tell your story, but your body won't let you. Imagine the frustration and fear of that. He set the papers down. Today we almost witnessed a terrible injustice. An innocent young man almost paid the price for other people's crimes, other people's laziness, and other people's prejudices. That cannot happen. Not in my courtroom. Not anywhere. Judge Dawson turned to the bailiff. I want a full investigation into Tyler Brooks and Kevin Davis. I want to know everything about what they did and why. And I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Not just for the vandalism, but for the perjury, for the false accusations, and for trying to destroy an innocent person's life. Yes, Your Honor, the bailiff responded. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering that all court personnel in this district undergo training on mental health conditions and disabilities. We need to be better. We need to understand that not everyone communicates the same way, and that's okay. He looked at Katie. Ms. Chen, your work today was exemplary. You fought for your client when the system failed him. You did the investigation that should have been done before charges were ever filed. You should be proud of the job you did here. Katie smiled, wiping away her own tears. Thank you, Your Honor. As for you, Daniel, the judge said, looking at the boy who was now sitting next to his mother, you're free to go. All charges are dismissed with prejudice, which means they can never be brought again. You're innocent. The court recognizes that you are innocent, and I hope that someday you can forgive me for the way I treated you today. Daniel pulled out his phone and typed something. Katie walked over and read it, then showed it to the judge. The message said, Thank you for listening. That's all I ever wanted. Judge Dawson nodded, his throat tight. Everyone deserves to be listened to, son. Everyone. The courtroom started to empty out. People were quiet, thoughtful. Many of them felt ashamed. They had been so quick to believe Daniel was guilty. They had been ready to see him punished. Now they realized how wrong they'd been. As Lisa and Daniel were leaving, several people stopped them to apologize. Some were teachers who had assumed the worst. Others were parents who had talked badly about Daniel without knowing the truth. Lisa accepted their apologies graciously, but she was exhausted. She just wanted to get her son home. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun was bright and warm. Daniel stood on the steps and took a deep breath. It was his first moment of peace in days. Katie stood next to them, smiling. You did great in there, she told Daniel, even though he hadn't spoken a word. You were brave just by showing up and facing all of that. Daniel typed on his phone and showed her. You saved my life. Katie shook her head. No, you saved your own life by documenting everything, by going to therapy, by doing the work. I just showed people the truth that was already there. Lisa hugged Katie tightly. Thank you. Thank you so much. We could never afford a fancy lawyer, but you fought for him like he was your own son. He deserved a good defense, Katie said simply. Every person does, no matter who they are or how much money they have. They talked for a few more minutes about what would happen next. There would be follow-up meetings. Daniel would need to give a written statement about Tyler and the bullying he'd experienced. But for now, he was free to go home and try to get back to normal life. As they walked to their car, Lisa put her arm around Daniel's shoulders. I'm proud of you, she said. You went through something terrible today, but you did it. You faced it. Daniel leaned against her as they walked. He still couldn't speak. Still felt the anxiety pressing on his chest. But for the first time in days, he felt something else too. Hope. Back in the courthouse, Judge Dawson sat in his chambers, staring at the wall. His clerk knocked and came in. Your Honor, the next case is ready when you are. Cancel the rest of my day, the judge said quietly. I need some time. Is everything okay? Judge Dawson looked at the young clerk. I made a terrible mistake today. I almost ruined a child's life because I was impatient and judgmental. I've been a judge for 20 years, and today I forgot the most basic principle of justice. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The clerk didn't know what to say. He'd never seen the judge look so shaken. Make sure that training I mentioned gets scheduled as soon as possible, Judge Dawson continued. And send a memo to all the judges in the district. Tell them about what happened today. Tell them we need to do better. Yes, Your Honor. After the clerk left, Judge Dawson pulled out a notebook and started writing. He wrote about everything that had happened. Every mistake he'd made, every assumption he'd formed without evidence. He wrote about Daniel's face, about the fear and pain in that boy's eyes. He wrote about the shame he felt. And then he wrote about what he was going to do differently. He was going to be more patient. He was going to ask more questions. He was going to remember that every person who came into his courtroom was a human being with a story, with struggles, with reasons for why they acted the way they did. He was going to be better. He had to be better, because if he wasn't, the next Daniel Thompson might not have a lawyer like Katie Chen to fight for him. The next innocent person might not have evidence to prove their innocence. And that was a thought Judge Dawson couldn't bear. 6 months had passed since that day in court. A lot had changed in that time, not just for Daniel, but for everyone involved in the case. Tyler Brooks and Kevin Davis had both pleaded guilty to vandalism and perjury. Tyler got a year in juvenile detention and 500 hours of community service. Kevin got 6 months and 300 hours. Their football careers were over before they really began. The college scouts who had been interested in Tyler stopped calling. His full-ride scholarship offer was withdrawn. Some people thought the punishment was too harsh. They're just kids who made a mistake, they said. But Judge Dawson didn't see it that way. They didn't just vandalize a building, he explained to anyone who asked. They tried to destroy another person's life to save themselves. That's not a mistake. That's a choice, and choices have consequences. Jessica Martinez got community service and probation. She had cooperated with the investigation and shown genuine remorse for her part in the false accusations. She wrote a long letter to Daniel apologizing for not standing up for the truth. Daniel never responded, but his mother told Katie that he read the letter several times and kept it in his desk drawer. Peterson, the prosecutor, was suspended for 3 months and required to undergo additional training on proper investigation procedures. He was also assigned to juvenile cases only, with close supervision. Some people thought he should have lost his job entirely, but others argued that he could learn from his mistakes and become better at his job. Time would tell if they were right. As for Daniel, life was slowly getting better. He was back in school, though he'd switched to a different high school in a neighboring district. Starting fresh somewhere new felt right. The constant stares and whispers at Lincoln High had been too much to handle, even after everyone knew he was innocent. His therapy was helping. He'd started speaking more in small, comfortable settings. He could talk to his mother easily now, something that had been difficult right after his father's death. He could speak to his therapist. He'd even started talking to a couple of new friends he'd made at his new school, though it was still hard and required a lot of energy. The selective mutism wasn't gone. It probably never would be completely. In large groups or stressful situations, his throat still closed up and the words wouldn't come. But he was learning to manage it better. He carried note cards with him that explained his condition, so teachers and other students would understand. Most people were kind about it once they knew. Katie Chen's career had taken off after the case. The local news had covered the story extensively, and suddenly everyone wanted to hire the young lawyer who had saved an innocent teenager from a wrongful conviction. She'd been offered positions at several big law firms with much better pay than her small practice could provide. But Katie turned them all down. Instead, she opened her own office specializing in juvenile defense. She wanted to help more kids like Daniel, kids who didn't have a voice or couldn't afford expensive lawyers. The work was hard and didn't pay as well as the big firms, but it felt right. It felt like what she was meant to do. Judge Dawson had kept his word about the training. Every court employee in the district, from judges to bailiffs to clerks, now had to complete a comprehensive program on mental health awareness and disabilities. The judge had personally funded part of the program out of his own pocket. He also started a scholarship fund for students with anxiety disorders who wanted to pursue higher education. But his biggest change was personal. He had become a different kind of judge. He was still firm and fair, but now he took time to understand the people who came before him. He asked questions. He listened. He didn't make assumptions. Other judges noticed the change. Some of them started following his example. Slowly, the culture in the courthouse began to shift. People talked about the Daniel Thompson case in law schools as an example of why assumptions can be dangerous and why thorough investigation matters. On a sunny Saturday morning in April, Daniel and his mother were eating breakfast when the doorbell rang. Lisa went to answer it and found Judge Dawson standing on their porch looking a bit nervous. "Judge Dawson," she said, surprised. "Is everything okay?" Yes, everything's fine," he assured her quickly. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I wanted to talk to Daniel about something, if he's available." Lisa invited him in. Daniel came out of the kitchen looking wary. He hadn't seen the judge since that day in court, and even though the judge had apologized, being around him still triggered anxiety. "Daniel, I'm sorry to show up like this," the judge said, sitting down on the couch. "I promise I'm not here in any official capacity. I just wanted to ask you something." Daniel nodded slowly and sat down across from him, his phone ready in case he needed to type. "I've been asked to speak at a conference," Judge Dawson explained. "It's a national conference about juvenile justice reform. They want me to talk about your case, about what happened and what I learned from it. But I won't do it without your permission. This is your story, not mine." Daniel thought about it for a moment, then started typing on his phone. He showed the judge his response. "Why do you want to talk about it?" "Because I think it can help other people," the judge said honestly. "Other judges, lawyers, police officers, they need to understand how easy it is to make the mistakes we made. How assumptions and laziness and prejudice can destroy innocent lives. If I tell your story, maybe some of them will think twice before making the same mistakes." Daniel typed again. "Will people know my name?" "Only if you want them to. We can keep you anonymous if you prefer." "But Daniel," the judge leaned forward, "I also think it would be powerful if you were there, if you wanted to share your story in your own words in whatever way feels comfortable for you. The world needs to hear from you, not just from me." Lisa looked at her son. She could see him wrestling with the idea. Public speaking was one of his biggest fears. But she also saw something else in his eyes. Determination, maybe, or purpose. Daniel typed for a long time. When he finally showed his phone, it said, "I've been working on something with my therapist. A speech. I was going to use a computer to speak for me. If I do this, can I do it that way?" Judge Dawson smiled. "You can do it any way you want. It's your voice, your message. When is the conference?" 3 months from now. "But there's no pressure, Daniel. If you're not ready, or if you don't want to do it at all, I completely understand." Daniel looked at his mother. She squeezed his hand. "It's up to you, baby. Whatever you decide, I support you." After a long moment, Daniel nodded. He typed, "I'll do it, but I need you to promise something." "Anything," the judge said. "Promise you'll tell them the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make you look bad. People need to know how wrong things can go." Judge Dawson's eyes got misty. "I promise. I'll tell them everything." Over the next 3 months, Daniel worked harder on his speech than he'd worked on anything in his life. He met with his therapist twice a week to work through the anxiety of speaking publicly. He rewrote his speech dozens of times, trying to find the right words to express what he'd been through and what he wanted people to understand. Katie helped him practice. Lisa listened to version after version, offering encouragement and suggestions. Even his new friends at school helped, giving him feedback and cheering him on. The night before the conference, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was making a mistake. What if people didn't understand? What if they judged him? What if his voice program malfunctioned, and he was left standing in front of hundreds of people with no way to communicate? His mother came into his room around midnight and sat on the edge of his bed. "Can't sleep?" He shook his head. "You know what your father used to say?" Lisa asked softly. "He said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing the thing anyway. You're one of the bravest people I know, Daniel. What you went through, what you're still going through, and you're still standing, still fighting. That's real courage." Daniel typed on his phone. "What if I can't do it? What if I freeze up there?" "Then you freeze," she said simply. "And that's okay too. Just being willing to try, that's already more than most people would do." "But I don't think you're going to freeze. I think you're going to get up there and tell your story, and people are going to listen. Really listen. And maybe, just maybe, you'll help someone who's going through something similar." She kissed his forehead. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day." The conference was held in a large hotel downtown. Hundreds of judges, lawyers, and criminal justice professionals had gathered from all across the country. The room was huge, with rows and rows of seats facing a stage with a podium and a large screen. Daniel stood backstage, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. His hands were shaking. His throat felt tight. The selective mutism was trying to take over, trying to shut him down. Judge Dawson came over and stood next to him. "You okay?" Daniel nodded, though it was clearly a lie. "You don't have to do this," the judge reminded him gently. "I can tell your story without you being out there." Daniel shook his head firmly. He pulled out his phone and typed, "No, they need to see me. They need to know I'm real." "Okay then." The judge squeezed his shoulder. "I'll go out first and give them some context. Then it's all yours." Judge Dawson walked out onto the stage. The room fell quiet. For the next 20 minutes, he told Daniel's story. He told them about his own mistakes, about the laughter in the courtroom, about the assumptions and prejudices that had nearly destroyed an innocent teenager's life. He didn't hold back or make excuses. He was brutally honest about his failures. "And now," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to hear from the young man himself. This takes incredible courage for him, so I ask that you give him your full attention and respect. Please welcome Daniel Thompson." Daniel walked out onto the stage. The bright lights hit him immediately, and he could barely see the audience. There were so many people, so many eyes watching him. His breathing got faster. The anxiety started to climb, but then he saw his mother in the front row. She was smiling at him, tears already running down her face. Next to her was Katie, giving him a thumbs up. And in the third row was his therapist, nodding encouragingly. Daniel took a deep breath and walked to the podium. His laptop was already set up there, connected to the sound system. He clicked on the file that contained his speech and pressed play. The computer's voice filled the room. It wasn't his real voice, but right now it was close enough. "My name is Daniel Thompson. I'm 18 years old, and 6 months ago I almost went to jail for a crime I didn't commit. Not because the evidence pointed to me, not because I acted guilty, but because I couldn't speak." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "I have selective mutism. It's an anxiety disorder that makes it physically impossible for me to speak in certain situations, especially stressful ones. It started after I watched my father die and couldn't call for help. I've blamed myself for that every day since." Daniel paused the speech and typed something new, something he hadn't planned. The computer voice continued. "Standing up here right now is terrifying. My whole body wants me to run off this stage, but I'm here because my silence almost ruined my life, and I don't want that to happen to anyone else." He continued with his prepared speech, talking about the false accusations, the courtroom experience, and what it felt like to be judged and mocked for something he couldn't control. He talked about Tyler and Kevin, about how they'd bullied him for years because he was different. "But this isn't just about me," the computer voice said, reading Daniel's words. "It's about every person who communicates differently. Every person with anxiety, autism, hearing problems, speech disorders, or any other condition that makes typical communication hard. We're here. We have stories. We have thoughts and feelings, and we deserve to be heard even when we can't speak." Daniel paused and looked out at the audience. He could see people crying. He could see judges who looked ashamed, probably thinking about their own courtrooms and their own assumptions. He could see lawyers taking notes, their faces serious and thoughtful. "Everyone has a voice," the computer continued, "even when they can't speak. The question is, are you willing to listen?" He stopped the program and stood there for a moment, looking out at the hundreds of faces staring back at him. Then he did something he hadn't planned, something he hadn't even told his therapist about. He opened his mouth and, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, shaky and rough from lack of use in public, he spoke his final words out loud. "Thank you for listening to me." The audience erupted. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some were crying openly. Judge Dawson, standing in the wings, had tears streaming down his face. Katie was on her feet, clapping so hard her hands hurt. And Lisa, in the front row, was sobbing with pride and joy. Daniel stood there, overwhelmed but no longer afraid. He had done it. He had faced his biggest fear and survived. More than survived, he had used his story to help others, to change minds, to make a difference. After the speech, dozens of people came up to talk to him. Judges apologized for times they'd been impatient with silent defendants. Lawyers asked for advice on representing clients with communication disorders. Other young people with selective mutism thanked him for giving them hope that things could get better. One older judge, a woman who'd been on the bench for 30 years, shook Daniel's hand with tears in her eyes. "I've been doing this job for 3 decades, she said, "and I've never thought about what it must be like for someone who can't speak to stand in my courtroom. You've opened my eyes. Thank you." Over the next few months, things continued to change. Daniel's speech was recorded and shared at judicial training programs across the country. Schools started implementing better anti-bullying policies, especially protecting students with disabilities. Several states passed laws requiring courts to accommodate people with communication disorders. Daniel became an advocate for others with selective mutism. He started a blog where he wrote about his experiences and offered advice. He did interviews through email and written responses, helping journalists understand the condition better. He even helped design an app that would let people with communication disorders pre-record messages for emergency situations. Judge Dawson kept that photo from the conference on his desk, just like he'd promised himself. But now there was another photo next to it. This one showed him and Daniel at a park, releasing balloons in memory of Daniel's father. They'd developed an unlikely friendship, meeting once a month for lunch. They never talked about the case anymore. They talked about baseball, movies, Daniel's progress in therapy, and the judge's grandchildren. "You changed my life," the judge had told Daniel during one of their lunches. "I was becoming the kind of judge I never wanted to be. Harsh, impatient, quick to judge. You reminded me why I took this job in the first place. To help people, not to punish them." Daniel had typed back, "You changed mine too. You showed me that people can admit when they're wrong and work to be better. That's rare." Lisa watched her son grow and heal over those months. He was going to graduate high school soon, and he'd been accepted to several colleges. He wanted to study psychology and help other people dealing with trauma and anxiety. The boy who couldn't speak in public was going to spend his life helping others find their voices. One evening, almost a year after the trial, Daniel sat in his room writing in his journal. It was something his therapist had encouraged him to keep doing. Tonight he wrote about how different his life was now compared to a year ago. A year ago he'd been terrified and alone, facing charges for something he didn't do. He'd been bullied, misunderstood, and almost lost everything. But now he had hope. He had purpose. He had people who understood him and supported him. He wrote, "I used to think my silence was my biggest weakness, the thing that made me broken and different. But now I realize it was my silence that led to my voice. Not a speaking voice, but something deeper. The voice that comes from standing up for yourself and others. The voice that comes from turning pain into purpose." He paused and added one more line. "Dad, I hope I'm making you proud. I'm not afraid anymore. Well, not as afraid. And I'm using what happened to me to help other people. I think that's what you would have wanted." That night, Daniel slept peacefully for the first time in years. No nightmares about courtrooms or accusations. No anxiety about the next day. Just peace. In his chambers downtown, Judge Dawson was finishing up some paperwork when he came across a note that had been delivered to his office that afternoon. It was from Daniel, written in his careful handwriting. "Judge Dawson, I wanted to thank you one more time for everything you did after that day in court. You didn't just apologize. You changed. You made sure what happened to me wouldn't happen to someone else. That takes real courage. My therapist says forgiveness is important for healing, so I want you to know, I forgive you. And more than that, I respect you. Thank you for showing me that even when people make mistakes, they can choose to do better. Your friend Daniel." The judge folded the note carefully and put it in his wallet right next to a photo of his own children. He would keep it there as a reminder to always listen, to always dig deeper, to never assume, to treat every person who came before him with dignity and respect, because everyone has a story. Everyone has reasons for why they are the way they are. And sometimes the most important thing a person in power can do is simply listen. That's what Daniel had taught him. That's what he would never forget. And that's how a silent teenager who couldn't speak in a courtroom ended up changing an entire justice system, one person at a time. Not through loud protests or angry speeches, but through quiet determination and the simple act of telling his truth. His silence had become the loudest voice in the room.